Every few years or so, I have to appear on one of the BBC's call-in programs to answer questions from the listeners, questions about my accent. And they usually go something like this. Where is Lyse Doucet from? Is she Irish? She's not American, is she? And then occasionally there's that odd, well, it's a bit rare, but still, that hangover from Empire, which someone writes in and says, good Lord, can't you find people with proper British accents to do those jobs? And so I dutifully every few years appear on the BBC and explain that actually I'm a Canadian. Canadian by origin, Canadian by identity and passport. I have Acadian ancestry, Scottish, Irish, Mi'kmaq, vrai Canadien. And every time I do this, I find myself getting just a little bit bolder every time. So the last time I did it, I said, of course, if you wink on radio, nobody can hear you winking, but I winked that actually I always regard my BBC career as a bit of Acadian justice. You see, we didn't get our lands back, but I got a job. And as you well know, in the Maritimes, we love job creation. And after that intervention, the BBC got letters from Acadians from around the world. Vive l'Acadie! Long live Acadie! Acadie en avant! Bravo, Lyse! And someone even wrote in and said, Lyse, you're the Celine Dion of Acadie and the BBC. Sacre bleu. But today I come from the BBC, and I come to your distinguished club, set up in the cold, dark winter of 1903 for men and women of consequence to shine some light on the news of the day. And so in this hallowed tradition, allow me then to talk today about some news of the day. The kind of news, the kind of history that defines a country, redefines it, changes a region and its sense of self, and even changes the world, including Canada. They call it the Arab Spring. Arab Spring. Whoever came up with this phrase, it is so delicious, so irresistible. Who wouldn't want to know about it? Arab, because it is in a region where politics has not changed for decades, where democracy became fossilized. I was in Jordan and in Iraq in the run-up and during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And Dima was there as well. And I kept urging what we would call moderate voices, both leaders and intellectuals, to come and be interviewed so that the political space wasn't just taken up by hardline voices. And then finally, a friend of mine who headed Jordan's most prominent think tank said to me, Lyse, what can we say? We have nothing to say. As Arabs, we feel humiliated. We are not writing our own history. History is being written for us by outsiders. And then came the Arab Spring. And if anyone knows about spring, it's Canadians. The time when the snows melt, when the flowers grow, a time of new beginnings. What a time it is of hope and promise. When this year began in January, I went to North Africa, to Tunisia, where the Arab Spring was born. I went to that small, poor town called Sidi Bouzid, where Mohamed Bouazizi literally lit the match that ignited a revolution. Fed up with mistreatment by the authorities, he burned himself alive. And his mother, Manubia, clad in black, consumed by grief, said, as any mother would, Mohammed was a good boy. All he wanted to do was make enough money to get a good enough job to support his family. And it was through selling fruit and vegetables from his little cart that he supported his widowed mother and his 7 siblings. How could Mohammed, with a small town perspective, just 26 years old, understand that day what he would inspire. Who could have expected? Who could have thought what would happen next? It's the stuff of history. The protests spread from Sidi Bouzid to Tunis. The government fell. President Ben Ali, the president for life, fled. And I'll never forget, in January, walking down the elegant tree-lined Habib Bourguiba Avenue in Tunis, where there were dozens of, we call them Hyde Park speakers' corners, springing up everywhere with Tunisians arguing politely, discussing, debating, asking questions. A kind of freedom we consider so basic, the kind of freedom denied to Tunisians. In fact, it was almost impossible to walk down Habib Bourguiba Avenue because everyone wanted to stop us to ask us questions. What a sweet feeling it was. And then from Tunis to Egypt, to Cairo, the capital of capitals in the Middle East, where Egyptians said, Mabruk, Tunis, congratulations, Tunis, Karama, liberty. But being Egyptians, they also said, Wallahi, if the Tunisians can do that, what about us, the great Egyptians? It took just 18 days of unprecedented protests to bring down President Mubarak. I still go to Cairo and say, how did they do it? Was a new politics of the street being born? Tunisia, Egypt. What was the rallying cry? The cry on the streets were, we have lost our fear. We saw the Tunisians marching down the boulevards, marching to stare riot police in the face. We saw the Egyptians running toward the tanks. And one day, the first day of the protest, we were on the 19th floor of the BBC's offices in Cairo. The 19th floor, and even there on high, we could smell and taste and have our eyes streaming from the tear gas below. And what did we see below? Protesters at one end of the street running down into the tear gas, picking up the canisters with bare hands and throwing them back at the troops and the tanks. We have lost our fear. In March, I went to Benghazi in eastern Libya. Liberated Benghazi, they called it, and they renamed their square to call it Tahrir Square, just like Egypt, Liberation Square. And in the middle of that square, a courthouse was transformed into a wall of protest, a wall of pain, of photographs. For the first time, Libyans were able to speak and to grieve in public about loved ones they had lost. 1,200 Libyans died one day alone in a mass killing at Abu Salim, Tripoli's most notorious prison. And you'd look at this wall, every one of the photographs meant something to someone. The photographs altogether meant something to a city, to a people, and to families being allowed to grieve. How do we, as Canadians, even begin to stand in their shoes? I found a way. One day, I went to the square, doing as I did on most days, looking at the photographs, looking at the people, looking at the photographs. And we saw a group of women by the side, and they were holding the pictures of their loved ones in frames. And so we moved closer, and we looked at the photographs, and then I stopped. In one frame, a smiling face, a familiar light wood background, a gown, a red gown, edged in blue and gold, a graduation gown from Queen's University. A Libyan man returned from our country armed with a chemical engineering degree, armed with hope. He went back to die in a prison, accused of the kind of politics that we call democracy. And the photograph was held up by his wife, Najla, pretty with her blue headscarf. She also went to Queen's. She studied literature. And her son stood with her, old enough now to go to university, too young to ever know his father. And at that moment, I felt two worlds collapse. Our world in Canada of such peace and promise, the world in Libya, so far away. But is it? Is it far away? But for Najla and for the other Libyans, those moments of freedom then turned into months of violence and war, a civil war. And the world responded with UN Resolution 1973, which authorized the use of all means to protect the civilians. Canada, as many of you will know, played a key role in enforcing that resolution. That didn't just protect civilians, it also brought down the government of Colonel Gaddafi. It's 10 years this month since this concept of responsibility to protect was forged. And most of you will know that Canada also played a decisive role in bringing that concept to fruition, ensuring that the world took note of it. And I was so pleased. I was in Ottawa last week. There was a seminar there with Kofi Annan and Lloyd Axworthy and Chris Alexander, whose parents, Bruce and Angie, are here today to discuss this. And I'm told there have been seminars across the country. Some of you may have gone to them, for Canadians to discuss responsibility to protect and to discuss the future.